folks, it's Zach at Feel Free to Argue, and want to talk a little bit more about the bailout and Timothy Geithner, who is proudly serving his corporate masters. First, I want to read a little bit to you from an article that appeared in the New York Times. Also going to link it in the sidebar if you want to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read you a little bit from the beginning. It's entitled, Geithner Said to Have Prevailed on the Bailout. The Obama administration's new plan to bail out the nation's banks was fashioned after a spirited internal debate that pitted Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner against some of the president's top political hands. In the end, Mr. Geithner largely prevailed in opposing tougher conditions on financial institutions that were sought by presidential aides, including David Axelrod, a senior advisor to the president, according to administration and congressional officials. Mr. Geithner successfully fought against more severe limits on executive pay for companies receiving government aid. He resisted those who wanted to dictate how banks would spend their rescue money, and he prevailed over top administration aides who wanted to replace bank executives and wipe out shareholders at institutions receiving aid. Now, this last sentence actually is incredibly important because, I don't think it's good enough to limit compensation. I think we should be limiting compensation as well, and we're clearly not doing that because, as I pointed out in a previous video, the current plan for restricting executive pay is just full of holes. So the whole notion that we're going to do anything to restrict executive pay at this point, I think, is pretty much up in flames. But more importantly, I think we can't even keep the people who are there because we're not going to get a full and complete accounting of what's happened at the banks. And I think this is exactly why why Geithner is trying to keep his old friends in the New York banking establishment right where they are and let them have all the money they want. This is just plunder. This is just pillaging. What really actually should be happening, and this is something that Galbraith pointed out yesterday on Democracy Now!, is that we need to make a clear determination of exactly how toxic the bank assets are. We need to get a full and open accounting. And there's really no substitute for that. And I remember somebody saying this at the very beginning, in fact. I can't remember. It was somebody in government. But I remember being very impressed by the fact that this person came up with a very simple question which nobody adequately answered. And he said that what we need to be asking at the very beginning, this is 4 months ago, is what is the government buying and what is it worth? And we've never gotten a real understanding of that. In fact, I think that the initial installment of the TARP funds was all about making sure that the banks didn't have to tell us at all how they were spending the money. And it looks like Geithner is looking to continue that, despite all of the claims of accountability and transparency. Geithner is fighting against that because he's a representative of the banks and these large financial institutions, and he doesn't care about you at all. But there's a process here. There's a process that could take care of the whole situation. Not painlessly, but it would be a start on a real solution and not a joke solution, which is what we have now. And that is, Geithner should not be involved at all. The role that should be played right now is by the FDIC chairwoman, who should go in there and just do an assessment as to whether or not the banks have capital to cover their liabilities. If they don't, they're insolvent, at which point they need to be broken apart, their management removed, a new management put in that will give us a full accounting of how toxic the assets are. In other words, how bad is the balance sheet? We need to find a way to separate the bad assets from the good assets and then relaunch the banks with the good assets and with new management, and probably with some new regulations to make sure that things don't get out of hand again. But the most important thing at this point is that we stop trying to save a system which is dead. We can pour as much money as we want into this hole, but right now we have no understanding of what we're even doing with it, where it's going, or whether or not it's doing any good. I would say that the evidence is pretty clear that the money is doing nothing so far. I certainly don't see any evidence. I mean, it would be hard to imagine that things would be worse without it. So I think we need to be doing some hard thinking about how bad this situation is, and we need to have, more importantly, a real substantive understanding of how bad the situation is before we progress at all and give even one more dime to the banks. And I don't think you can do that with the current management of the banks. I mean, everything about their attitude in recent times has indicated that they have no interest in changing, no interest in giving us a full accounting. They just want us to turn over the money, and aside from that, leave them the fuck alone to do whatever they want with it. Well, I think this is totally unacceptable and empirically unwise. So that's what I think should be happening. And as always, you can feel free to argue. Looking forward to your comments.